who of you has never heard of Zapier before? Okay, good. Well, now you have, so I'm done. What I'm going to talk about today is lessons we learned from integrating with 1,500 APIs over the past 8 years or so. So, a little bit about me to get that out of the way. My name is Fokke Zandbergen. I've been working for US-based companies ever since I left college. This is not the best name to have if you do that. I've actually used a different name for a time. Then we got back from some months we spent in Hong Kong. We settled, we had kids. We were like, I'm never going to work for an international US whatever based company again. So I'll give my name, Timo, that I used, to my first child as his second name. Not knowing that a few years later I was back in an international team, and I never really picked up the name again. And now you already have all of these usernames all over the place. I'm like, who cares? At least people remember me. So if you want to keep in touch, I'm under the Fokke ZB handle on pretty much any network, so you can find me there. Enough about me, about Zapier. Zapier was, the idea first came up in 2011, to be precise, on September 8th, so we just had another birthday, at 10:20 a.m. This is the actual screenshot of one of our co-founders, Brian, on the top right, and Wade, our CEO, about his idea. So it was pretty vague, but it was very meta, and they love meta. So me now talking about them chatting about meta is even more meta. So we have hit quite some milestones since 2011 when the idea came up. A few months later, they graduated from Y Combinator and raised 1.3 million, and that's the only money we've ever raised since. Because in May 2014, Zapier was profitable, and ever since we've funded all of our work through our own revenue. In June 2016, we were at 1 million users and 10 million ARR. August 2017, we hit the milestones of 100 employees. We're currently at 270, 80-ish. January last year, we had 1,000 integrations on the platform. And beginning of this year, there was 1,500. And I believe right now it's about like 1,700 or so. So that's about the company, but what is Zapier really about from the user point of view? So what we're into is allowing users to make connections between online software that otherwise they would need a developer for. So our goal, just to be clear, is not to put you guys out of work, just to address the use cases that users have, both in small businesses, also at home, up to bigger enterprises, but mostly focus on smaller teams within companies that they don't really want to, either don't have the money or it's not the right timing to spend to really automate that in an in-house solution. So they want to create these workflows that simply respond to one thing happening in one app and then maybe do one or more things in another app. So this is an example, like when I get a new email in Gmail, I want to trigger, and then I want to copy the attachment to Dropbox and alert me in Slack, and then send along the link to the Dropbox file. There's, like I said, about 1,600, 1,700 integrations right now with Zapier, so that means you can make countless of connections between those apps. And what we've seen is that as Zapier has become more of a household name within small business, companies even start using it as a criteria for the apps that they are going to use. If it doesn't have a Zapier integration, they won't use it because they want to be able to connect it to everything they already use. So in developer speak, you could look at one of our workflows like this. So you create a zap, as we call it, a definition of a workflow. And it is a list of different actions. And really the only thing that makes the first action different from the others is that that it is the initial trigger. So I will later go into details on the different types of triggers that we have. but that will just kick on its own. Like in this example, it will kick off every 5 minutes. So in this example, there will be a trigger getting the entries from a Wufoo form and then creating subscribers in MailChimp. So we would run this workflow every 5 minutes and then simply go through all the steps, allowing each step to pick from previous values of previous steps to then use. So in this case, the MailChimp action will grab the email from the Wufoo entry and then use that to create a subscriber. This is a huge simplification of how it actually works, but this is kind of the gist. So of course, for users, we have a nice interface, and actually we just launched a new editor, which I probably should have made a screenshot of because it's way better. But the idea is still the same. You add different steps in your Zap, in your workflow. You can map fields. So in this example, we're in MailChimp, and then we're doing a search in MailChimp for that subscriber to see if they already subscribed. And as you can see by the icon, we've linked a Wufoo field there named what is your email address. So we want to search by that value. So that allows users to easily create mappings between triggers and actions that will then power that workflow. Any questions about that? Is that clear? Super clear? Okay, great. Let's look at the other side of the medal then. As a developer of these apps that we integrate with, you'll want to be able to define these triggers and actions for users to use. So we also have a nice interface for that. You'll tell us how we can authenticate the user with your API, and then create triggers and actions and define which fields they should accept, and then the API request or multiple requests that we need to make to actually execute that action. So you'll recognize the right part of the screen, which is a preview of the editor. And in this case, there's a task name field with some descriptions. And then in the API configuration tab, you would actually define the request that we're going to make to execute this particular action. So, of course, being a developer, you'll probably want to have the choice between using the UI or actually developing it in code. So we also provide an SDK, which you can use to do exactly the same thing. It runs on the same backend. It's just another way to define exactly the same thing. So you can create, using our APIs, triggers, actions, and export a definition of your integration of your app. Any of you already here who actually build a Zapier integration? Coming in here, I actually noticed 2 startups that had on their banner Zapier integration. So you of course have experience with that. Did you like it?
We use it every now and then, like for random things.
For internal integration, that is? Yeah. So that's maybe a good distinction to make. So the 1500 that I mentioned are public integrations. So any user that signs up for Zapier can use this integration. But you don't need our permission, or you don't need to pay us anything to create an integration with Zapier. And you can use that internally. So we have also thousands of integrations that integrate with tons of product, but are only used within the company themselves. So that could be some kind of internal API. But we've also seen cases where power users just need more access to more features in a particular app or API than the integration that is public offers. So they build their own integration. So there's public integration, but there's also private integrations that you can then invite anyone within your company or beyond to use. So with that context of how Zapier actually works, let's look at some lessons that we've learned. Because we've built, over the years, probably between 100 and 150 integrations ourselves, and assisted thousands of developers in building these private and public integrations. So we've dealt with a lot of APIs. So one thing we've learned is you don't want to reinvent the wheel. In particular, when you use the SDK, you can pretty much create any request and use any protocol. But if you have a standard REST JSON API with OAuth 2, ideally using REST hooks, which is a standard that we introduced that I'll dive into later, and open API standards, that will make it super easy to create an integration with Zapier. And we're currently working on actually allowing you to import your open API spec and then just scaffold your integration and only select what you actually want to expose to the user. So definitely don't reinvent the wheel. Also, don't save on documentation. I've been a developer advocate before, and as a developer, I want access to documentation without needing to log in or anything. Sure, the marketing department would love to have the email addresses of people that actually use the documentation, but you want that to be out there publicly. It's helpful for us jumping in and not needing an account to help out the developer. But it's also, you should look at your documentation of your API as marketing material towards developers. They will judge your app and your API by your documentation, not by your shiny marketing page. So definitely don't save on that documentation. Make sure it's complete, it's versioned, and ideally uses standards. Another thing so the first step in creating your integration with Zapier is defining the authentication. So there's tons of types that we support, and you can implement all kinds of custom ones. Most of them use some kind of secret token at some point. It's very important that these tokens never expire. Because if a user has a Zap running that runs every 5 minutes and it does some kind of critical thing for their business, they don't want to find out waking up in the morning that for the last 8 hours it wasn't able to run because some authentication expired. So make sure that these secret tokens never expire unless we have a refresh token, which should then never expire unless a user revokes that token. So please don't do that. We still see that. Also, make sure you encrypt them. So we are aware that we're dealing with very sensitive data. We have tons of data flowing through Zapier, and we have the credentials for all of our users to access all of their apps, all of their tokens. So we make sure that we encrypt them on a separate service, separate database, and we keep them encrypted in flight, and in any of our logging we censor them so that even our own staff cannot see them. So please do the same thing on your end. So having set up authentication, a trigger. Let's look at how that works internally. So we have two types of triggers. We have triggers that pretty much define some kind of list endpoint that returns a bunch of objects. So what we're going to do is pull that endpoint every 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the user's plan. So you can imagine that that's a lot of data flowing through the interwebs and through our servers. So you want that data to be as small as possible. So ideally, your API, your list endpoint, should be able to limit the results, like on any sensible number, or maybe based on a timestamp, like give me any results after, like in the past 24 hours or 8 hours. You also want us to be able to paginate through that list. So not just like have a hard cap of you can like request 100 and that's it. You want us to be able to go through these pages to get all the data as well. And make sure that each response also includes meta information about what is available. How many pages are there? If it uses token pagination, what are the tokens? How can we get the next page? Make sure that the information is there. You also want to have tons of options on your endpoints to do filtering and searching. We actually have a filter app available to users so that they can set up a trigger that, for example, let's take the Gmail trigger, triggers on any email message. And then you could add a second action, which is a filter app, which then provides conditions. So you're like, only emails from my wife or from my mother, whatever, from my boss. Ignore all emails from my boss. So you can absolutely do that. But we charge users per action that they run. So they're very thankful if your trigger has built-in filters, so that within setting up their trigger, they can, or like in the Gmail trigger as well, they can define these filters within that step, not needing to rely on additional actions in their Zap. I know that will cost us money, but it will also give us more happy users, and that's our primary goal there. Another way to make sure that we don't deal with too much data is field mask, or any way, there's not a lot of standardization around that, but any way to reduce the number of fields that you return. If you don't need all the data, don't return all the data. Of course, GraphQL is great at that. We don't support that in our UI, but you definitely can do that in using the SDK, since you can pull in any NPM package, so including any package that deals with constructing GraphQL requests. So you absolutely can do that. Only return the data that we actually need. Order, another thing we deal with a lot. A very common nightmare that we run into with developers is that the list endpoints returns all data sorted from old to new with no information about the number of objects, the number of pages, or whatever. So there's no way for us to get access to the most recent data. So you want the endpoint to be sorted by any field in any direction, but in combination with filters, it's still something that you want to be careful of, because what could go wrong with this particular arguments to a list endpoints, assuming that they are sorted by the creation date descending? Any idea?
Order.
Yeah, so assuming this order, that they're created descending, so that's exactly what we want, like the newest items on top. But if we limit to 10, and then we filter on only like the published items of some sorts, if the 11th, if the newest 10 items were all published, and then I have some item that I created like 2 weeks ago, it's probably on like page 4 or 5. So even though it's sorted from new to old by creation, if I'm filtering on published, I will still not get that item. So it's really, as a developer building the Zapier integration, you want to be careful of all the different combinations that a user can make and make sure that the data is actually accessible. And this is something that we run into a lot, because most of the APIs only have a limited set of fields that you can sort by. So this would all be fixed if I could sort by the publish date, for example. That would immediately solve my problem. So something we run into a lot. So if we do this polling on new items, we need a way to identify what is new. So we use the ID field for that. But of course, if you're triggering on updated stuff or some other combination of factors that could determine if something is new, for example, we have a Google Sheets updated row trigger. So any change in that row must trigger that workflow. In that case, in your integration, you will define a custom ID, which is actually a hash of multiple fields. So that's how we control if something is new and if we should trigger that zap for that specific item. So all of these previous slides, you can pretty much forget about if you use something that we introduced 5 years ago, which is called REST hooks. And lately, we've seen a lot of adoption using different names in Google's APIs. They're called notifications. In our APIs, they're called webhooks. The idea is that only when you first create that workflow, we will create one request to your API, giving you a unique URL that we expect you to make a request to every time something new happens. And this saves us a tremendous amount of data. This is up to 99% less data that gets transmitted. Because if you only have you have your own personal web shop with some funny t-shirt that you designed, you have maybe like one order every day, polling every 5 minutes is a total waste of data. And even if you then have that t-shirt order, you might have to wait for 5 minutes to actually see that workflow run, because that's the interval that we pull for new items. So with REST hooks, we would immediately be notified, and that workflow would immediately run. And we've seen that translate to a much better user experience and also better adoption. So we've seen 24% with Wufoo in particular, which we did some comparisons on between using webhooks and before they used webhooks, and it had much better user experience after they switched to webhooks. Any questions about these oddities that we deal with? Okay. How much time do I have, Max?
Like 5 minutes for sure.
Cool. So let's dive into some fun stuff that we run into. This is something we see a lot. And even with very popular APIs, Slack, where they tell us that they respond with a 200, which is fine, right? And then in their body it would say status error, and even code 404. This is terrible, because if they would actually respond with 404, our platform would automatically recognize that as a not found error and handle that accordingly. So if your API responds with status codes, please use the standard status codes. Same goes for HTTP methods. I'm not going to mention the same name again, but if you have an API to create, in this example, books, and it's a get, that's not what that method was about. So don't use it if it's not meant to be. Another funny header that gets just tossed in randomly sometimes is content type. So if we say that we accept application JSON, and you think about yourself as a JSON based API, please respond in JSON. Also when there's errors, like this is a very common thing that we see with APIs that are not implemented using some kind of standard library. They miss these edge cases where, oh, all of a sudden there's an error, and they spit out their standard server HTML page in HTML while we ask for JSON. And even if they do respond that they are responding with JSON, sometimes we just get, and this happens a lot with errors, just a plain text string. So yes, please speak the language that you say you do. So finally, I have some slides on the nitty-gritty details on how we implement. But I can go through them, but I also can take questions on how we deal with certain problems, and based on that. I'm pretty sure I have some slides to answer some of them. It's up to you. Slides? Come on. Nobody has a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so there was mentioned GraphQL in one of the slides, but did you consider using it for some of the integrations? Did you have experience with that?
Yeah, we have some integrations that use it and works fine. Basically what we do in the SDK, you can either define the request that we should make for the action or the trigger in sort of a template. Just tell us the method, the URI, the params, everything like that. Or you can just completely take over. And we give you the data that was mapped to your action, and it's up to you. So that's what the integrations that use GraphQL at the moment do. They just pull in a package from NPM, take the input that the user gave to that particular action, and then compose their request. And in the same manner, we still see APIs using SOAP requests. So yeah, you can pretty much do anything. Yeah.
Do you have plans for more like high-level integration with GraphQL frameworks like Apollo or Relay?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that there's talks about how we can find a good way to integrate this in the UI, because we see the adoption growing. We want to expose it, but the interface is really focused on non-developers within smaller companies that have an interest in developing an integration with Zapier, but don't really have that knowledge to do it on the code level. So we're quite sure if we would really be addressing the need of developers there, or if for them it would just be easier to drop into the code.
When I'm using your SDK and developing an integration, does it run on your infrastructure or do I run it on my servers?
Good question. There it is. So every integration is a Node.js app, be it generated from the UI or hand-coded. It's a Node.js app. You keep the source, and just whenever you build a new version for us, we generate an AWS Lambda function using that code, and then call that Lambda every time your trigger or action runs. So that Lambda includes your full integration, and we call a handler that has like, this is the action that needs to run, this is the data going in, and these are the authentication credentials. And then you can do whatever you like with that. So basically it looks like this. You get a Z argument which has some utilities, and the authentication and the input. So we're bound to the limits of AWS, so this means that the integration can only be 50 megabytes, and also the payload, so the data that we send into that function, can only be 6 megabytes, and you need to finish your work in 30 seconds. But that's what an integration is. It's a Lambda function.
Can I just but does it mean that you're being like seen, you're not passing binary data through a platform? So all the binary data is any through around, just go around the platform.
Yeah. So each integration in Lambda is sandboxed. So you don't have access to any data of other apps, not any of the other connected accounts of the user. You only have access to what is mapped to your actions input. Now, for files, we're not going to pass through binary data to these Lambda functions because we cannot. There's 6 megabytes limit, so that's just not feasible, and it will also take too much bandwidth. So what we do instead is that what we send to the integration is a public URL where they can get that binary data. So a lot of APIs have these URLs. So when they trigger, or as a result of an upload action or whatever, they return a URL where that data can be fetched. And often that has, like an S3 upload, has a long hash. So it's secure by its URL because the hash cannot be guessed. So that's safe to pass on to the app. Now there's also apps, of course, like Dropbox, where there's no such thing. So they do have an URL where we could get the binary data, but we would need to be authenticated, and we don't want to allow the consuming next action to actually have these credentials. So what we provide on that Z utility that I just showed is a stash function. So you can pipe in any data that you would want to expose to other actions on a private URL using the authenticated request within your own sandbox, and then stash it. And what it will effectively do is take the binary data, upload it to S3 in a bucket of ours that expires in, I believe, 7 days or so, and then take that public URL with the long hash and give that to any action that follows your action. So through that, binary data is available to any app, but as a developer, you need to stash your data if it's only available in a private way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how do I handle item potency if I am consuming some API? For example, if the API returns a different result every time, but there might be some overlap between 2 consecutive results.
Yeah.
How do I not process the data I have already processed in the last round?
So are you talking about if a user defines a workflow and then it runs on different items and these items differ between each other?
Yeah, for example, the API call returns me a list of orders in my website every time, and if a new order is returned, I get the last 10 orders every time, but I only want to process the order which I did not process last time.
Oh yeah, so that's what we use the ID for. So in all of those items, we'll look for an ID field, and if the ID is not seen by us before, we'll trigger on it. And the first time you turn your workflow on, we'll do an initial poll to get all of the items that are available, and then create a hash of their IDs and store them, but not trigger on them. So we won't trigger on any historic data. Only from the next poll on, we will see any new object identified by its unique ID. And we use, this is very a simplified version, but we use Redis for that. So we create a hash, push it to Redis, and then if that hash is already there, we've already seen the object.
But you store data for the whole your life. I mean, the hashes of the whole period of the company.
Yeah, well, every time you turn your Zap off, we can get rid of that, because when you turn the Zap on again, we will do that initial poll again and then stash those IDs. Yeah, but some Zaps have been running very long, so they have like thousands, maybe even a few million hashes. But we use Redis Lab, and that scales like crazy. So we just keep sending data there.
Okay, talk a bit about your skill. Like, what is the most used API integration? How many calls a day? How many Lambda functions does it spin up at a regular point in time?
I don't have any numbers at hand. I do know that when I prepared a talk early this year, we had a couple of millions requests every hour that we dealt with, but we're growing rapidly, so I have no idea what the numbers are now. But yeah, you can imagine, like, I don't know the exact number, but I think from the 1,500 integrations, I think about 800 would be polling-based triggers. So yeah, our paid users are on 5-minute intervals. The others are on 50 minutes. But yeah, you can do the math. That's a lot of requests that we make every 5 minutes to all of these apps.
Yeah, related to the question, have you had any complaints from the APIs that you use maybe too much? Because if you're polling a lot, you may be one of the biggest users of someone's API. Yeah,
well, we did. Well, we of course get complaints in the form of rate limiting. So we respond to that and we back off and we leave them alone for a while. We also work with Google to move from polling to their notifications APIs because they kept on like raising our quota, and they were like, please folks, implement it. So yeah, and of course it's also in our own interest because bandwidth is pretty cheap, but it's not free, so we want to reduce the load as well. Yeah.
So about the different apps that you guys integrate, some of them, maybe most of them, we have like a free tier and a paid tier, like the one, the MailChimp and all others. So how is that solved in UI when I like have a free MailChimp account? I have that amount of functions available to me to connect to, and if I have a paid MailChimp account, I have like a bunch of those.
Yeah.
How is that solved?
So the question is, how do you handle APIs that their features depend on the plan of the consumer user? So it really depends on the integration. We try to do our best. Like, we're always the last ones to catch the error in the end if the integration itself doesn't take care of it. And we try to interpret as many weird formats of errors that we've seen. Hopefully they have a status code. They might not always. In the extreme case, if we have no way to figure out what is happening, we'll display the status code and the raw message to the user. Hopefully it's something that they can figure out. So you'll run into some integration that if you try to use a specific action or trigger, you'll get a weird error. Gladly, there's a lot of APIs that are more like more graceful in that they like make a request. For example, when you connect your account, which gets all the permissions, they cannot hide actions or triggers per user. But then, as you define your Zap, you will test it each step, and that's when these integration will spit out a helpful message like you need to be on the paid tier to use this. Yep.
Do you have any plan to integrate like OpenAPI from banks?
OpenAPI from?
Yeah, they have introduced like last year, I believe. Every bank in Europe provides API to access your data, and it would be a great idea can just use Zapier and all the banks in just one source which I want to use.
Yeah, I know we have a couple of integrations, but I'm not sure about if we have any European-based integrations because of the new legislations about, what is it, PSP2 thing? Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe that's something that we can talk about. Yeah. I'm happy to learn about use cases and see if we can mean something there. Yeah.
Got a question on how do you deal with APIs that introduce breaking changes down the line?
We hate them.
Yeah, but do you inform users? Or?
Yeah, well, actually, that was something that was a very interesting side effect of dealing with so many APIs. Not only do we run into all of these different weird cases, and we try to, every now and then we do an engineering post on our engineering blog about like best practices, and we try to also talk with our partners, see if they can improve the error messages. But we're also often the first to notice if an API has a breaking change or if they have an outage, for example. We have a lot of bots in our own Slack channels. And for example, since we rely on GitHub, we have a bot that informs us if GitHub reports some kind of status issue that they have. But we also have bots that inform us of spikes in errors that we see on our own infrastructure. And our own bot is always first. He will immediately signal, like, looks like the API of GitHub is down. And then 5 minutes later, there will be an official GitHub status incident. So, and the same thing happens with breaking changes. We're often the first ones to find out that it's too late. Now, what we would hope to push, and I know that the Italian government is working very closely with the OpenAI API spec on including a lifecycle field there. Because that will be extremely helpful, because then we could, maybe every day, maybe every week, pull the OpenAPI spec from an API and then check that lifecycle field and see like, okay, this API version is deprecated. It will no longer be supported in 2 months. We need to alert the developer of the integration that they need to prepare the integration for the new version. But unfortunately, there's no standard of API deprecations. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.